Your closing argument.
Thank you, Your Honor. I didn't move. I've been sitting here this whole night just waiting for you guys, so I'm glad you're back. I saw some donuts. I hope those are Randy's. I couldn't see. They look like they were. You will certainly enjoy them. I will recommend the Bear Claw, the cinnamon roll, and the cream filled. That's the one to hit first. So I want to briefly cover some issues about Bob Durst in particular. And let's dispel some of just the ideas that are out there. Bob Durst is not crazy, okay? He's not some nut job serial killer who goes around killing for the thrill of it, etc. He also did not do what he did because he allegedly has Asperger's or is on the spectrum. And I want to take a second to deal with that. He's free to get up here and say whatever he wants, and that's what he did. But let's not forget that that was completely made up, it's manufactured, and it's demeaning because there are millions of people who are out there who have to struggle with those conditions. And the idea that somehow he gets to get up there and blame his murderous conduct or the way that he treats people because I have Asperger's and I'm on the spectrum, it's insulting. It demeans and it delegitimizes all of the real struggles that are out there that people deal with every day. And by the way, the defense got up here in opening statement, and what did they say? You're going to hear an expert who's going to come in here and they're going to tell you about Bob Durst Asperger's and Bob Durst's spectrum disorder. Did not happen. There is one piece of evidence that demonstrates that Bob Durst is suffering from Asperger's, etc., and that's him. That's Bob Durst, the same man who you've heard talk about shaving his head to get sympathy from jurors, talking about faking eye conditions so he doesn't have to work in jail, talking about faking dementia. These aren't just things I'm making up or, you can argue that Bob Durst fakes illnesses. It's out of his own mouth, and he admitted to it on the stand. So I want to make sure that you all understand that in essence, this is just made up out of whole cloth. It's designed to get you to feel sorry for him. It's designed, like everything else, to relieve him of the responsibility for what he does, who he is, and how he's lived his life. What is Durst? He's a narcissistic psychopath. What does that mean? That means that Bob Durst is only concerned with Bob Durst. That's it. That's what he lives, breathes, and thinks about. Listen, Bob Durst is not somebody, he's not getting up there, he's not John Wayne Gacy who's killing for the thrill of it, etc. Something you have to understand about Bob Durst. Bob Durst killings, if you're going to actually say that murder can make sense, they make sense. And this is what I want you to think about. People that are crazy, they end up, they kidnap somebody they've never met, they kill them for the pleasure of it, maybe there are sexual things involved. That's not Bob Durst. What happened in this case? He killed his wife. Now, what are the circumstances of that killing? And by the way, the defense keeps telling you don't know what happened to Kathy. We don't know what happened to Kathy because the evidence is he got rid of her. You don't get to kill somebody, get rid of the body, and then argue you don't have a case. That's what he tried to do with Morris. He was one stupid decision from getting away with it. If he just dumps those body parts any other place, we have no evidence. It looks like Kathy Durst. So Bob Durst is not somebody who kills for the thrill of killing. If you think about it, the only difference between Bob Durst and the rest of us is that for everybody else out there, for people who are not narcissistic psychopaths, murder is not a means of resolving their problems. People don't go, gosh, you know what? I don't like my boss. He's a real jerk. Yeah, I could quit, sure, but I've got a lot of tenure here. Yeah, I'm going to just have to kill him. That's not how people work. But for Bob Durst, murder might not be his first option. It might not be his second option. It might not be his third option. But in the end, pushed into a corner, murder is an option for him. And it's an option that he has utilized at least 2 times with Susan Berman and with Morris Black. So it's really important that you understand who this man is, what he has done, and why he has done it. And by the way, That is the reason why we spent so much time. If you look at how this case started, we started with Bob Durst. Who is he? Because in order to understand what he did, you have to understand who he is. He's a person, he's privileged, he's a narcissist. I can do whatever I want. Why does he get food stamps from the government? He doesn't need the money. He does it because he wants to do it. He enjoys it. He likes beating the system. How do you know? He told you. It comes out of his mouth. This is, again, the reason why most of the most damaging evidence in this case comes directly from his mouth. It's not myself or Habib or Ethan getting up here and making arguments. It's out of his mouth. So we started with, who is Bob Durst? And Bob Durst is someone who his whole life, and he tells you, he's done whatever he wants. And not only that, when he talks about his work, what does he say? I would show up afternoon wearing nothing more than a jock, and I would make it clear to everybody that I didn't have to do what they did because I'm me. That's an honest self-assessment of who he is. That's not Asperger's. That's not being on the spectrum. That's just being a jerk. And I believe Mr. Durst at one point, I think he referred to himself as an asshole when he testified at one point. Hard to argue, but that's not a condition, that's a choice. And that's a choice that he has made in how he's going to live his life. So let's talk about the defense argument in this case. What they want you to do is, it's like this picture. They want you to look at each piece of evidence and they want to magnify it out. They don't want you to put any of the evidence together. They don't want you to focus on the whole picture. They want you to focus so far in that in the end, what they need you to do is, Bob Durst, for you to find him not guilty, you have to ignore. I mean, there's so much evidence in this case, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Bailey and I were talking about this. It would be nice if we could just take some of the evidence, put it on hold, and use it for our next case. I mean, there's enough evidence in this case to convict this man 7 times over. But what does the defense do? They want to look at each tiny piece of evidence or large piece of evidence, and they want you to just focus on it independently. Much like this picture. When you look at this picture, you can't see what's going on. But you know what? If you back up and you end up seeing the forest and not just the trees, it makes a lot of sense. And that's what they've tried to do. They want you, ladies and gentlemen, they don't want you to see the forest. They want you up close and personal, staring so close at that tree that you don't know where you are. But it's not going to work. And by the way, Mr. DeGuerin talked about the presumption of innocence. And let's be real clear. Right now, and I think I gave this example in voir dire. If I didn't, I usually do. Right now, I end up, for whatever reason, I lose my temper. Maybe I'm typing too fast. I'm talking too fast, and one of the court reporters looks at me with a bad look, and I snap, and I assault her. Deputy Washington comes in there. He tries to handle me. Due to my superior fighting skills, I take care of him. Remember, this is my story, so I can make it up as I want. 4 more deputies come in here. They are, of course, also dispatched. By the way, when I went to trial, even though all of you were witnesses here, saw the whole thing, I'm presumed innocent. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't commit the crime. It's very simple. It simply means that when Bob Durst came in here, before evidence was presented, he was presumed to be innocent. That presumption lasts until you evaluate the evidence and until you decide, you know what, the evidence demonstrates him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's just not get caught up with the idea that somehow, because he's presumed innocent, he factually is. We've proven him beyond any reasonable doubt to be guilty of everything that we've discussed in this case. Now, what's also interesting is that the defense has another theory in their closing argument. They're going to pretend that, in essence, Bob Durst didn't testify. Other than insult me and say how I'm a bully and I'm mean and I beat up a sick old man, they're not going to talk about any of his testimony at all. They're just going to completely ignore it. It's kind of like when you whistle through a graveyard, you're nervous, you don't want to look around, it's a little bit scary. I'll just pretend I'm not in a graveyard. I'll pretend I'm in a beautiful meadow with lovely flowers in the middle of the day. Well, here's the problem. He did testify. He testified for 14 days. And by the way, what's the other excuse that they use in this case? There's always an evil villain. Always. in a Bob Durst prosecution, there's an evil villain. That's what they do. And what do I mean by that? Well, you have in the movies, you have, I'm not as intellectual or as big of a movie buff as Mr. Millie is. My favorite movie is The Other Guys, which he says is terrible. Well, he says it's good. It's just not on the equivalent of Tarantino, etc. But Friday the 13th, there's Jason. Famous evil guy. Darth Vader. Famous evil guy. Jaws. Very scary movie. Saw that when I was 11. Still not over it. Will not go in the water. Very frightening for those of you who are close to my age. You look at it now and people, oh, that's not scary. That was a scary movie. So there's always an evil villain in his cases. And if we look around, who were the evil villains that he had in this case? If you think about it. Well, originally it was Seymour Durst was the evil villain. Seymour took me, said, wave bye to mommy. Complete lie. He was caught up in it. This traumatic event of his father telling him to wave goodbye to mommy, he can't tell the same story twice. Is it his grandfather? Is it his dad? It's neither. It's made up, as his brother Douglas testified to. You can't even see that area of the roof from the window he's talking about. And does it make any sense? Does anybody really believe that Seymour Durst is going to take his little boy and go, hey, wave to mommy as she jumps off or gets thrown off, pushed off, jumps, whatever, slips while she's on top of a ledge? It's absurd. But it's designed to make you feel bad for Bob Durst. Because listen, if you can focus on 7-year-old Bob Durst who lost his mother, and listen, that's a tragedy. There's no question. I'm not saying that Bob Durst, just because he's wealthy, that he has not had some tragedy in his life. But everybody has tragedy. And you don't get to kill people because at age 7 you lost your mom. Douglas is horrible. Douglas treated him poorly. His whole family treated him poorly. You heard the testimony from Douglas. Bob was the oldest, and Bob bullied everybody. He bullied Douglas. He bullied Tom. You heard Tom's testimony. Tom's a close to 70-year-old man, and when he's talking about instances with Bob Durst, it's like he's 6 or 7 years old. He's never gotten past that. He's never gotten over it. Jeanine Pirro, and it's interesting. Whenever Mr. Chesnoff talks about her, he says, and she's a Fox News host. She's a Fox News host. As if that somehow matters. I don't know, is the idea that because most of us here in California are more liberal, that if he adds Fox News, it's going to inflame, et cetera? It has nothing to do with anything. Jeanine Pirro did an absolutely abysmal job in this case, obviously, from start to finish. But they made her the villain in Galveston. That's what they did. Bob Durst talked about it. You heard it. Andrew Jarecki. Andrew Jarecki gave him scripts. Now, listen. Great interesting point about Andrew Jarecki. They're saying, where is he? They stipulated to his testimony. They stipulated. They didn't have to agree to that stipulation. They decided that it was in their client's best interest for him not to testify in court. And if they wanted him to testify in court, they could have brought him in. So they say, well, Bob Durst said that Andrew Jarecki created these scripts for him. And why didn't the prosecution call him? Would you like this trial to be a year long? So maybe I should try to find Danny Cunningham or Barry Weiner. If we sit there trying to call witnesses to impeach his absurd statements, we'd be here for a year. And in the end, there's no need to call Andrew Jarecki because that story doesn't make sense for all the reasons that we've talked about and some others I will discuss. So, who's the other villain in this case? It's me. I'm the villain. I'm the bad guy. I noticed, and it was interesting to me, that during closing argument, Mr. Chesnoff mentioned my name more than he talked about his own client's testimony. And I want to address this really offensive characterization head on. So in Mr. DeGuerin's argument, the first thing that he did after mentioning cockroaches was to go on the attack against me. His comment was something to the effect of that I beat up on a sick old man. Mr. Chesnoff, again, basically did the same thing. And I want to make something clear. No one on my team, we're not going to apologize for the way we've approached this case. We're not going to apologize. We have a job to do, and we've done it ethically, and we've done it professionally, and we've done it completely. And whether And I understand whether you found at points Mr. Bailing or Miss Miata's personality to be offensive, you should not hold that against them. Not everybody's as lovable as I am, and it's unfair. Listen, all jokes aside, I'm an aggressive prosecutor. There's no question. I don't hit from behind, I hit straight coming on. And when they're making these criticisms, I want to ask you one thing. You imagine tomorrow that a loved one of yours were murdered, and you ask yourselves, what kind of prosecutors would you want on that case? How aggressive would you want them to be? How diligent and prepared and relentless would you want? Ask yourselves that, because in the end, we're not in a mock trial. This is not moot court. This is not some fact pattern that we just dreamed up. That man killed 3 people. Killed 3 people. He's up here, he's old and he's sick. He got to live to be old. He's 78 years old. Kathy never made it to 30. Susan Berman, his close friend, brutally executed. Morris Black, murdered and then dismembered. Yeah, he certainly has health issues now. No question. They are completely exaggerated. They have nothing to do with anything other than pity. But he's got some health issues, but he's lucky to have gotten to live to be 78 to have the health issues he does. Because his victims and their families, they don't have that same peace of mind. They don't have that same rest of their life, that same outlook, that same opportunity. Kathy's family, they've been grieving, you heard them, for 40 years without complete answers, which they'll probably never get. So when you start feeling sorry for Mr. Durst, if that's how you're feeling, or in essence, you end up going, gosh, why did Mr. Lewin on cross-examination, how come he was so aggressive? Interesting, during Mr. Chesnoff's closing argument, he said that, quote, Lewin did not ask non-leading questions. He only wanted the answers he wanted. What? If you remember, most of my questions were open-ended. That wasn't an accident. I asked open-ended questions because that would make him have to answer. You can always lead a witness, but if you ask an open-ended question, hey, why did you do that? Why did you say that? Can you explain this? They have to answer and explain it. And the idea that somehow we're responsible for cross-examining that man with his lies, they chose to call him to testify. Their decision, Bob Durst's decision. He chose to get up on the stand and repeatedly perjure himself. He chose to get up there and to tell you, you know what? I'll perjure myself about any important question you ask me. And then, in probably something that has never been heard in any case I'm ever aware of, he admitted, oh yes, I've lied, I've perjured myself 5 times about something in this case. He wouldn't tell us what it is, but any sympathy for Mr. Durst is really misplaced. And by the way, again, I'm not bringing this issue up in a vacuum. The defense is the one who opened the door to this by basically attacking our prosecution, attacking the cross-examination, calling their client a sick old man who's being bullied. That sick old man, he's 78 because he's gotten away with these cases for a lot of years. Age is not a defense. Infirmity is not a defense. When you murder somebody, there's a reason we don't have a statute of limitations on murder. There's no statute of limitations for those families. There's no time that they just stop suffering. You heard Jimmy come in here. You heard Ginny come in here. You heard Mella come in here. They're not over that. They'll never be over that. Because when you lose a family member or a loved one, that's a loss that you don't recover from. You don't get closure. The best you can get is justice. That's it. It's all we can give. But it's what is called for, and it's what those families and what society and what you all and what he is owed. So the idea that somehow Mr. Durst who elected to perjure himself on the stand deserves your sympathy is absurd. I'm actually trying to go a little bit, I've got a lot of stuff to cover here, and I'm not going to finish it all. So I'm going to do the best I can going through this, so I'm kind of periodically, I'm going to have to end up kind of skipping what I've got going so I can get this done. Oops. So this was Mr. Durst's reaction. Do we have sound? This is Mr. This is Mr. DeGuerin's reaction when he's talking about Bob Durst's admitted perjury on the stand. Nope. Bring in the experts.
Or my contacts today, I can't see.
All right, I'm gonna, while they're working, actually I can't because.
You need to turn it off. Turn it on?
It's always helpful.
"9 days of beating up of a sick old man who can't defend himself. Calculated to cause you to hate him."
So again, Bob Durst is the victim. No comments by Mr. DeGuerin about his client's admitted perjury. The idea that the cross-examination was, quote, calculated to get you to hate him. If you hate Mr. Durst, it's because of the answers that came out of his mouth and the conduct that he has shown in this case. It's abysmal. The one thing that is shocking about Mr. Durst's testimony is never have I seen somebody who will do more horrific acts that he admits to, particularly involving domestic violence, horrific things to his wife, and then look you straight in the eye and say, "I'm not a domestic violence abuser. I never abused her. That's not abuse." So nothing was, quote, calculated to get you to hate him. It was calculated to get you to understand who he is and what he's done. All right, I want to talk about Susan for a minute. Whatever the circumstances with Susan, and listen, like all of us, she was a flawed person, okay? Everybody in our lives, anyone we know, we're all flawed in some ways. Being murdered, and Susan definitely had her issues. Being murdered does not make somebody, it's not a qualification for sainthood. So when they get up here, and let's be clear, they do the same thing with Susan they do with Kathy. The idea is that they want to dehumanize her. Mr. Chesnoff gets up and he says, "Why would Bob confide in Susan Berman when she can't keep a secret?" Susan has a big mouth. Susan lied a lot. Susan treated people crummy. Susan was bad to Mella. Susan was a disloyal friend. Susan was, they don't want to say she's blackmailing Bob for money. And by the way, no one has said that Susan affirmatively blackmailed Bob for money. The evidence would demonstrate that to Susan, Bob was very wealthy, he had the money, and she was asking him for cash. Now, Bob obviously knew that Susan held the secret, and she's held that secret since 1982. And Bob Durst told you on the stand, he understood how things worked. Susan never came out. She didn't send him threatening emails. She sent him a letter that didn't even ask for money, and his response was, of course she's asking for money. But in the end, no matter what you think of Susan, no matter how much they want to degrade her, or degrade Kathy, or degrade Morris, these were not people who deserved to die. And even if, by the way, even if you think Morris or Susan or Kathy were the worst people in the world, your oath as jurors, you don't get to kill people or murder them because they're blackmailing you, or because you don't like them, or because you're having a bad divorce. So as you're sitting here and you're thinking about the victims in this case, it's not Bob Durst. He is not a victim. He's the perpetrator. They're the victims. All right, what evidence is there that Durst actually told Susan the truth about what he had done to Kathy? This is what, is that good here? Okay, the evidence suggests that Susan believed, by the way, that Kathy's death was some type of accident. And you want to ask yourselves, do you really think that Bob Durst, when he got a hold of Susan, oh, and we heard this, well, where's the phone records? Where's the emails? Do you really expect, Bob Durst, we know, he called Prudence from a payphone, according to the testimony. Do you really think that because you can't find a call on the Sunday night or Monday morning from Bob to Susan from the house, do you really believe that that means that, oh my gosh, well, how would they set up this conspiracy? It's absurd. But here's the other thing. Do you really think for a second that Bob Durst called up Susan or told Susan, hey, listen, I murdered Kathy last night? Of course not. He doesn't tell the truth. He would have twisted what happened in a way to get Susan to help him. And you know what that would have been. Probably very similar to what she told Susie Harmon, which was that, you know, Kathy fell on the stairs. The defense looks at that and they say, aha, that shows they're lying. That shows that they're inconsistent. No, what it shows is Susan told different people different versions of the same overall idea of what Bob Durst had done. So the idea that Susan knew that Bob murdered Kathy, and we talked about this before, whether or not, even if Kathy was accidentally killed, it doesn't matter. Because in the end, Susan Berman helped Bob cover up what occurred. So whether it's murder or manslaughter, doesn't matter. Accident, in the end, Susan Berman was the ticket to Bob going to prison. And he knew it. And he told you how terrified he was of Janine Pirro. So why would Durst, the liar that he is, why would he have told Susan anything else other than it was an accident? Of course he wouldn't have. Now, apparently, there's one thing in this trial, a couple things that Mr. DeGuerin and I agree with.
I am proud to stand before you and defend Robert Durst when almost no one in the world would do so. But me and my small team.
So that clip is not the correct one that's supposed to be there, but I'll deal with that one. This is what happens when you're having to put stuff together quickly. Let's talk about that clip. Mr. DeGuerin is not Matlock, okay? He is not sitting in here overcome by the awesome powers of the state, etc. You've seen 6, 7, 8 different defense attorneys coming in and out. I'm not criticizing them, that's their right. That's Mr. Durst's right, he's a wealthy man. But to pretend that somehow, here's poor little old Mr. DeGuerin up against this terrible, and he calls us the government.
Excuse me, objection, Your Honor, based on People versus Hill, disparaging defense counsel. It's improper.
Overruled. No, it's not disparagement. Overruled.
So, in the end, Mr. DeGuerin got up there and he decided to tell you how proud he was of defending Bob Durst, his right, and he told you that he's just it's a small firm defending this man against the massive power of the government. It's absurd. Mr. Durst is on trial because he killed somebody. The evidence is being presented because Mr. Durst created that evidence. The length of the trial and the amount of lawyers that are on it have to do with how much there is to present. Now, the clip that I was supposed to have that I don't have is where Mr. DeGuerin says they have proven that Bob Durst, maybe it's going to be this one. There we go. So they've proven Bob Durst is a liar. That's what they've said. So we agree on this. But then they say, what is the evidence that he killed Susan Berman? And I want to stop for a moment because anybody who's going, well, they spent X amount of time on Kathy. They spent X amount of time on Susan. They spent X amount of time on Morris. Think about it for a second. we spent the most time on Kathy because in the end, that has the most evidence of motive. It has the most evidence of domestic violence because the two of them were married. And that's the genesis for all that happened. With Susan, in the end, what do you have? Bob Durst went down there, he shot her in the back of the head, and he left. We've impeached his alibi 6 ways to Sunday. He's now admitted he found the body and wrote the cadaver note. The fact that we were able to put on an incredible amount of compelling evidence against Bob Durst relating to Susan Berman doesn't make that case any weaker. It's incredibly strong. So the time was spent on Kathy Durst because that's where the evidence of Mr. Durst's motive, that's where it starts. All right, who had the motive? So let's talk about what's the evidence that Bob killed Susan. Who had the motive to kill her? Only him. There's nobody else that we have, no evidence of, not one other person in this case. Nobody. Who had the opportunity and the plan to kill Susan? Well, we know that Bob Durst, he has a motive because where do we sit right now? Susan Berman, according to his own sworn testimony, he is saying that he's known for 5 years, his best friend, that she's out there telling people that he killed his wife and she covered it up. You don't have to believe myself or the witnesses. Mr. Chesnoff spent an hour of his closing yesterday talking about how these witnesses who testified were either lying or mistaken, had implanted memories. Your client is admitting that Susan was telling everybody and she was doing it 5 years before she was murdered. He also admitted that he was terrified of being charged by Janine Pirro, that she's unethical, that she'll indict a ham sandwich, etc. So imagine the situation he's in. Let's even say for a moment, let's take the defense at their word. Well, Bob didn't kill Kathy. Okay. Kathy disappeared, never to be seen again. It's now 20 years later, and they're reinvestigating, and your best friend, somebody that everyone says will do anything to protect you, has been telling people for 5 years that you killed your wife and that she helped you cover it up. Janine Pirro, if she hears that information, what's going to happen? Well, you know Bob Durst is going to get charged. So, by the way, do you have to believe my assessment on that? That's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm terrified. I'm so afraid that I find out about it, I vomit, and then I leave and I take off for Galveston to live in a flop house as a mute woman. He is terrified of what Janine Pirro is going to do. And then, in the midst of all this, you have Susan Berman making the call to him and telling him, hey, listen, the police have reached out to me and I'm going to talk to them. By the way, who's the source of that information? In other words, are we simply suggesting, well, that was the motive, Bob probably knew? He got up there and testified. He told Andrew Jarecki, they had a call. Susan told him, police are trying to get a hold of me and I'm going to talk to him. And if you remember, he says in that clip with Andrew Jarecki, what am I going to do? Well, we saw what he was going to do. He decided, you know what? That's a loose end I got to get rid of. And as narcissistic as he is and as violent as he is, you can't fault the logic. When he told Nick Chavin it was her or me, I had no choice, that's a true statement. The problem for Bob Durst, from his perspective, is not that he killed Susan Berman, it's that he killed her about 20 years too late. And this also brings up the issue of, well, why would Bob Durst have Susan Berman help him when everybody knows she has a big mouth? Well, when you've just killed your wife and you need somebody to help you, you got to have a friend that's going to actually do it. And Susan Berman, as Bob Durst said, there was nothing she wouldn't do for me. When he was asked, well, would she lie to you? I don't know. During the New Orleans interview, would she have called? I don't think she would, but I don't know. And all of her friends said, oh, absolutely. Susan would have done anything for Bob. So Bob didn't choose Susan because she was the best person to help him. He chose Susan because she was available and she was willing. So what other information do we have? Who does the crime scene evidence point to? I mean, I don't even know how we can get any more. He says he's there and he sent a cadaver note, which he says only the killer could have written. He has himself being there and Susan breathing on him. He has himself in the house when, by the evidence, Susan should be in rigor and her body stiff. she's not, even though he says she's cold. So the problem for him is that his lies, like everything else with Bob Durst, he's lazy. And his lies, although they sound good coming out, they don't survive any examination at all. He believes Susan was about to rat him out to the police. Remember his expression when I was interviewing him in New Orleans. And I say to him, Bob, you didn't know that Susan never talked to the police, did you? And you get a moment of honesty from him. No, I didn't. He's realizing, oh my gosh, maybe I didn't need to kill her. But it's too late. We know he traveled to Los Angeles, staying in Beverly Hills. A minor point, but if you notice, Bob Durst kept getting on Emily Altman, saying that she mixed things up. And he talked about mixing up hotel names. And if you think about it, what Bob Durst was saying is that she said I stayed at the Beverly Hilton. Where he really stayed, very likely given his testimony, was the Beverly Hills Hotel. And again, for any of you going, well, where's the records of that? Well, how are you going to get records when you don't find out about it until 15 years later? So we have that. Who fled California immediately after Susan was killed? Bob Durst. Who wrote a note that only the killer could have written? Who fled when incriminating evidence came out? Meaning, with the Jinx, episode 5, what does he do? He's out there, he's got the gun, he's got the mask, and the gun, if you remember, with a bunch of extra ammunition. I was going to try this on, but I remember a case that we handled that involved some evidence that someone tried on. It didn't go well, so I think I'll put it down. So that's what he did. That's who he is. And finally, he's admitted to killing her multiple times. This evidence points in one direction and one direction only: Bob Durst. No matter how much the defense wants to argue and protest, that's what they've got. Now, during their closing, Mr. DeGuerin also attempted to minimize. He said, hey, why was all the evidence presented regarding Kathy Durst? Why was all the evidence presented regarding Kathy? And what he ended up talking about was he ended up, in essence, saying that, listen, well, I can't do any better than Mr. DeGuerin.
And, the prosecution has proved that Bob's treatment of Kathy was atrocious. We told you, and jury selection, even on the long form stuff that you filled out, there was questions about domestic violence. There would be evidence of domestic violence. That's the way it is. But there's been a lot of domestic violence and not a lot of killing. Many marriages have had their share of domestic violence, and sometimes the people get past it and go on together, and sometimes they don't, and that's the end of it.
What does that even mean? There's been a lot of evidence of domestic violence, but not a lot of evidence of killing. Well, Bob Durst was married to one person. He denies any domestic violence. The domestic violence was horrifying. Most people, by the way, if you were shown, even if you had done it, just imagine that you had pulled your spouse's hair and dragged them out of the house in front of their family, that you had done that. You're going to deny that to the core because it is just so offensive, so shocking. He literally told you, that wasn't a big deal. You heard him tell Jarecki, and the quote was, some people say I pulled her out of the house by the hair. Some people say I pulled her hair and a big clump fell out. Either one is close enough. There's no regret. There's no remorse. And then Mr. DeGuerin gets up here and talks about there's been a lot of domestic violence, but not a lot of killing presented. Well, we presented evidence he killed 3 people. I don't know what that means. And then he says, well, domestic violence happens all the time, and not every woman gets killed. It's absolutely true. But you ask yourselves this: how many women do you think that are killed by their spouse, by their partner, how many of those women do you think there was not a history of domestic violence before it started? And the idea that somehow this evidence isn't fair, Judge Wyndham has had this case, and you can tell by the records, for many years. We've litigated motion after motion. If Judge Wyndham allowed evidence to come in, it's because that evidence is appropriate for you to weigh according to his instructions. And the evidence of Kathy Durst, if we're going to demonstrate that Kathy Durst was killed, then we have to be able to talk about the relationship that they had. Now, during the cross-examination of Dr. Leslie Hain, I think this was Mr. DeGuerin, if my memory serves me right, he basically said to Dr. Hain, she was the ER doctor, he called the black eye minor domestic violence. You've seen worse, Dr. Hain, haven't you? I don't know if you remember what her response was. It was what anybody's response is. Yeah, has she seen worse? I'm sure she has. Unfortunately, as we all know, pushing and shoving and abuse and arguing lead to physical violence, and sometimes, like Kathy, they lead to death. All right, why did we start with Kathy? Because everything in this case begins and ends with Kathy. You want to ask yourself for a minute, how could we even have presented this case without her? Let's say it was left off. Let's say we didn't do it. There'd be no motive at all, right? So it would just be Bob killed Susan Berman. Well, why did he kill Susan Berman? Don't know. Defense would be up here going, why on earth would Bob Durst have killed his best friend? They have no motive at all. So in essence, if you put on the evidence and motive, they say that you're being unfair. And if you don't have it, they say you don't have any evidence. So without Kathy Durst, there's no connection to Susan Berman, and there's no connection to Morris Black. And what perspective or understanding would that give to you all as jurors trying to figure out what happened in this case, trying to understand? You are told, you'll get an instruction that says if you decide that Durst committed a homicide against Kathy Durst, you may, but are not required to consider that evidence for the limited purposes of deciding whether Bob Durst believes Susan Berman would be a witness in a prosecution of the crime, and deciding whether the defendant had a motive to commit the murder of Susan Berman as alleged in this case. Now, you don't have to find that prior domestic violence, you don't have to find that to be true beyond a reasonable doubt. You only have to find that to be more likely than not, which we've shown. By the way, the defense has admitted to domestic violence. There's nothing for you to even weigh going, did this happen? Mr. DeGuerin got up there and said there's been a lot of domestic violence. There hasn't been any murder. Bob Durst denied it, but he admitted the conduct, but he basically just refuses to acknowledge that it's anything serious. Now, it also says, that instruction, you may consider that evidence for the limited purpose of deciding whether Durst had a motive to kill Morris Black and whether he had a plan or scheme to kill, dismember, or dispose of Morris Black's body. Why is that? Because the evidence demonstrates that Morris Black knew who Bob was the only person who could connect Bob Durst to Avenue K, and that Morris knew about Janine Pirro. How do we know that? We know that from Bob Durst's testimony. You may also consider the evidence. Oh, I'm sorry, I just read that to you. Why was all the evidence presented regarding Morris Black? Mr. DeGuerin was very clear that Morris Black had nothing to do with this case. However, Bob Durst had something else to say when he was up there. That's a theme of the defense closing argument. They're not just arguing what's inconsistent with the evidence that was presented. They're actually arguing inconsistently with what their client testified to. Because in the end, they can't explain it. So they just pretend it didn't happen. Let's not talk about these 14 days other than to say how terrible and mean, and he's old and sick, and I was a bully, and I kicked a puppy on the way in, etc. That's how they've chosen to handle that testimony. So this is what Mr. DeGuerin had to say about the Morris Black situation during his closing.
My opinion from the evidence is it's here to prejudice you. It's a terrible case. It's terrible what Bob did to Morris Black's body. And those pictures are awful. I know some of you turned away from them. Some of you couldn't look at them. They're that bad.
So why were those photographs admitted? By the way, the judge admitted that evidence. It was admitted. And you have the instructions, and the reason it was admitted is because it's the people's theory, the evidence demonstrates, beyond any doubt because he's admitted to it, he dismembered Morris Black's body after an alleged accident. Well, there's a similar relation to Susan because he says basically the same excuse. It's the dog ate my homework twice. Why did you not call the police? Why did you send a cadaver note? No one was going to believe me about Susan, so I had to send a note. Why did you dismember Morris? No one was going to believe me, so I had to dismember his body. And it's important because we all know, and it's the first thing anybody thinks of. If it's an accident, you don't dismember somebody. I mean, dismemberment, and by the way, Bob Durst tells you a lot. When he's describing how, you don't do it the goddamn way that I did it, where you're cutting through the bone, etc., he sounds like he's discussing building a shed. It's completely removed. It's narcissistic. It's psychotic. It's viewing an event as if he wasn't a part of it. Scary. It's also frightening. But in the end, it's not frightening because it's prejudicial. It's frightening because it's evidence that Bob Durst did the same thing to Kathy that he did to Morris. It's evidence that the dog doesn't eat your homework once, much less twice. It impeaches what happened with Susan. And it's very interesting. They talk about how much we wanted to prejudice. We're having all these photos. Mr. Milius did the section about Morris Black in the closing argument. Do you know how many photos he had of Morris Black's corpse in his closing argument? Those are all the slides. 0. Not one. Now, by the way, he certainly could have had one, but the idea that we're up here, quote, trying to prejudice this jury, it's insulting, it's untrue, and it's, again, another attempt to get you to focus on things that have nothing to do with the evidence in this case. So, Morris, the situation with him, like Susan, he was a witness and a threat to Bob. He was the one person, other than the two alleged bank tellers. Yeah, some of this stuff, you're asking Bob, was there anybody else that knew you were in Galveston? And he just makes it up on the spot. Yeah, there were 2 tellers. What's their name? One of them he can't name. The second one he gives a name. He dated both of them. And they knew who he was. But even he says, yeah, they knew who he was, but the bank did not have that address. And where's the evidence? Where are those 2 bank tellers? We can't call them. One of them doesn't give them a last name. We don't find out about them until we're in court. Do you think with all these 7 lawyers, 8 lawyers they have, if there were positive evidence that they could give, if they existed, don't you think they'd be here? Of course they would. So the other issue is that in the end, Morris Black being a threat to Bob Durst is the reason why Bob Durst dismembered the body. That's his defense. He's basically saying no one was going to believe me. I have to now get rid of the body because they're going to suspect me because of Kathy and because of Susan. I don't have a choice. So in the end, we all agree as to why Bob got rid of Morris's body. It all ties back to Kathy and Susan, which is why Morris ties back to Kathy and Susan. So your job is to weigh the evidence and to weigh it, and it's Calgic 375, which I'm not going to read right now, but it lays out, and it's very clear. In essence, you consider that evidence for the reasons that we said. That evidence of Morris Black goes to, number 1, the dismemberment of Kathy Durst, and number 2, the motive for Morris Black relates to Susan and Kathy, and you can consider both. What did Mr. DeGuerin also say in closing? There is no direct evidence in this case. Now listen, you can have your own argument. You don't get to have your own facts. That is untrue. There is overwhelming amounts of direct evidence. Confessions, admissions are direct evidence. So he might want to tell you that his client's confessions are not credible. But to say there's no direct evidence, incorrect. This also has compelling circumstantial evidence. And if you think about that, contrary to Mr. Chesnoff's argument, physical evidence is circumstantial, it's not direct. And the physical evidence in this case is the cadaver note. And the idea that they want to say that, well, you don't have DNA and you don't have fingernail scrapings from someone who was shot from behind, it's absurd. Absolutely absurd, especially when their client has admitted, and they stipulated to it, that he found the body and was in the house. As we said, the most likely explanation for that is that in the end, Bob Durst was wearing gloves. He planned to kill Susan. He went in there, he shot her in the back of the head, he got rid of the gun. I'm going to talk about the gun in a moment. But if you think about it, the only difference between Morris Black and the amount of evidence they found there and Kathy Durst is that he dumped the stuff in the bay. If he dumps it in the swamp somewhere on the way to Louisiana, by the time they find anything, Morris's place is gone. No one knows anything. The trash has been emptied. There's no gun. He gets away with it. Murder's not that hard to get away with, ladies and gentlemen. You all know that cases go unsolved all the time. Generally, to get caught, you have to make a mistake. And Bob Durst makes a lot of mistakes because in the end, and he's told you, he said it. Why did he tell Detective Struck that I had drinks with the mayors? Who would say that? I mean, they're going to talk to the mayors. Bob said he wasn't used to anybody questioning his veracity. He was used to the way it was with the Durst organization. It was like a negotiation. I said how it was going to be, and that was it. So his privilege and his entitlement and his ego and his narcissism play in to everything that he says. All right, let's talk about the most damaging, and these are only a few of them, admissions in this case. So we have the confession out of his own mouth, Bob Durst's own mouth. It was her or me, I had no choice. Those 9 words. From Bob's close friend. I'm going to go over that in more detail in a moment. Nick Chavin is also a villain in this case. And by the way, you know how damaging the Nick Chavin stuff was because you can hear the jail calls, the attorneys showing up at Nick's office, Bob talking about how worried he is about Nick, Bob mentioning after a couple of years of not talking to Nick, within 40 seconds on the jail call, he's bringing up the dinner. He knows what he did, and he knows what Nick's situation was, and he thought, and Susan Giordano thought, that Nick was going to keep his mouth shut. And for a long time, Nick did. So we have that confession. It was her or me, I had no choice. Killed them all, of course. And remember, and I mean, this is like what a 6-year-old comes up with. Actually, what I was saying is, they'll think I killed them all, of course. Well, wait a minute, it's recorded. Where is it on the recording? Well, the mic did pick it up. Well, you listen to it, the mic's picking it up. Oh, yeah, I guess I didn't say that, but that was in my head. Are you kidding? It's patently absurd. We've got the call, and this call is pretty chilling.
Anyway, so Lisa Apollo says she moved into the Need Heroes. I saw that. She was like a maid. And the assistant's opinions about whether or not Douglas helped me dispose of the body. I understand. I love it. Yeah, the only thing I think, though, is that Douglas may be behind Lisa Apollo. Oh, then it's Janine Pirro who must think that Douglas is, Oh, yes. Yes, she thinks that Douglas helped you. Right. You might decide to, depending how things go, to confirm her thoughts.
Now that's a conversation with Bob Durst and his wife. And there's a couple of things that are very clear. First of all, both of them are very clear in this conversation that there's no issues that Bob Durst killed his wife. There's none. Nobody says, his wife doesn't say, well, Bob, you know that's not true, or how can they accuse you of that? Bob Durst doesn't say, well, that's not correct. And what do we have here? The beginning of it is, they're basically saying that Janine Pirro thinks Douglas helped you dispose of the body. Durst says, Douglas helped me dispose of the body. It's clear. He doesn't say Janine Pirro's wrong about it, that's what he says. And what does his wife do? his wife, instead of saying, well, that's not true, you don't have to worry about that, says, hey, you know what? Douglas might be behind actually providing that information. And in fact, his wife's then comment is, well, she thinks that Douglas helped you. Again, perfect time for Bob Durst to say, well, that's not true. How can he help me get rid of a body I didn't kill? I might decide, depending on how things go, to confirm her thoughts. That's a confession. That's what that is. There's no other reasonable way you can look at it. And then, even in trial, and by the way, for all the time that apparently we wasted on cross-examination, every day there were new and important details coming up. This is late in the cross-examination, maybe the last day.
You are now saying that the point of that was you're trying to get a plea deal, correct? And a plea deal, the point of a plea deal is that in the end, in order for your plea deal to go through, you have to give us what you're offering on your end, and we have to give you what you're requesting on our end. Is that correct?
I never said I knew what happened to Susan. I never said I knew where Kathy was buried.
How can he mention Kathy being buried when it's not the question he's being asked? No one is telling him that Kathy was buried. Nobody knows what happened to Kathy. Well, one person knows, Bob Durst, and that's why he slipped. Because the problem, and we all know this from our own human experience, what undoes liars is keeping track of their lies. And he tells so many of them that in the end, it gets very difficult for even Bob Durst to remember which lie he's told to who. And sometimes the truth slips out. That's 4, ladies and gentlemen, 4 different, what we will argue are confessions. Now, during the defense, they basically had what I will call an evolving defense. What does that mean? Well, evolution, you kind of go from monkeys to man, goes one way. Not in this case. In this case, it goes back again. It's constantly moving. This defense in this case is constantly moving. What does that mean? Well, you saw it happen before your eyes in real time. It was apparent in the cross-examination of witnesses. So, it was apparent in Durst's ever-changing statements. So if we talk about how it worked with witnesses, listen to what happened with Lorraine Newman. In a 20-minute cross-examination, Mr. Chesnoff is suggesting 3 completely mutually exclusive possibilities. What's he saying? Lorraine Newman was lying because she never told those statements to police in 2001. Now remember, you know who disagrees with that question? Bob Durst. Because Bob Durst is saying Susan's telling everybody.
So you can't remember what you said in January of 2001, but in response to Mr. Lewin's questions about what Susan Berman told you, you're 100% certain.
Well, I think that that's much more memorable than... I think it's more memorable than what was the last thing you said to her.
Okay, well,
what was your last conversation? Was the topic. I think being told that other thing is a lot more memorable.
More memorable than talking to the policemen that are trying to solve the murder of your dear beloved friend?
Well, you can frame it that way if you want.
Well, I just did. Do you think it's more memorable?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chesnoff was suggesting that Lorraine Newman was lying. Now let's back up for a second and figure out what would be her motive for that. Does that make any sense? But you can argue, if you're the defense, you can pick one of 3 theories. You can say the witnesses are lying. I'm going to cover in a moment why that doesn't make sense. Or you can go with option number 2. And these are inconsistent. You cannot be lying, but also honestly mistaken due to drug use, hallucinations, or implanted memories. Same witness, same lawyer.
Okay, and you would agree with me that when you're 16 or 17 years old, your brain probably hasn't fully developed, has it?
That's correct.
And so taking hallucinogens at a time when your brain is in development can cause impairment, can it not?
With the frequency that I took it, I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay.
So Lorraine Newman, by the way, said, I was into cocaine. I tried hallucinogens. And the argument is, Mr. Shedd was suggesting because at age 16, she took a hallucinogen that 20 years later, that somehow that created a memory. Now, we all know this. Drugs, unless you're taking an LSD trip, drugs do not create memories that are not there. What drugs do is they wipe out memories that you had. But again, what's important is Mr. Chesnoff, with the same witness, is arguing two completely inconsistent theories. First, she's lying. Well, if you don't believe she's lying, then let me try number two. Well, she's mistaken because of drugs and implanted memories. Well, if you don't like that, ladies and gentlemen, let me give you box number three. Box number three is that Lorraine wasn't lying, and she wasn't honestly mistaken. That maybe what Susan said was true, but that there could have been an innocent meaning to the statement. Now, that's kind of a new one. He didn't really go into this much, but the idea would be that, well, you misunderstood. Susan told you that, I guess, she gave Bob an alibi, but you're making a guilty explanation out of it.
You use the word alibi. Alibi doesn't necessarily mean something sinister, does it?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay. So, for example, if you took your wife to the train station because you didn't want her to drive and she'd been drinking too much, and she left on the train as far as you know and then disappears, if Susan talked about that, that could be an alibi, couldn't it?
Certainly.
So that doesn't even make sense. We all know that when you're talking about an alibi, it's almost always in the context of a criminal situation or a situation where you're in trouble. Where you've got lipstick on your collar, husband. What's going on with that? No, I wasn't with my secretary. Actually, my client gave me a kiss, and that explains, etc. What he's talking about makes no sense. And that's really the only time that can... Now we have the fourth. And this is really... There are primarily three situations. Maybe Lorraine's not lying or mistaken, but Susan was lying when she told Lorraine that she had given Durst a false alibi. And by the way, this again where you have a problem. This is Mr. Durst's argument. It's not what his lawyers are arguing. Now, here's the problem for his lawyers. What they say isn't evidence. What he says is evidence. So, Mr. Chesnoff getting up here and telling you, forget the science, or follow the science, whatever that means, and not even mentioning what his client is saying. Hey, again, you want to whistle through the graveyard? That's fine. You want to pretend you're in a flowery meadow? That's fine. But I'm going to make sure that jurors, you're not in a flowery meadow, you're in a graveyard, and I'm going to remind you of what's going on in that graveyard.
Okay. And then you go on to state, and I swear to you, at one point, she told stories about her childhood. They would get more and more inflated to where she actually said to me, my family sold me to gypsies. Remember telling that to Mr. Lewin?
Yes.
And that was an example of how Susan could obviously embellish or make up a story, correct?
Yes.
And you also told Mr. Lewin when you came to Susan, it was hard to know what was true and what wasn't, correct?
There were times, yes.
So, which version is the defense arguing? We don't know. They're arguing all three. But we know what Mr. Durst is arguing. Mr. Durst is very clear. The evidence in this case is, he says, those witnesses are not mistaken. Those witnesses are not lying. That's what Susan told them. So that's the evidence that you have. By the way, as I said, all of his options, they're all mutually exclusive. At most, only one of these explanations can be true. But there is a fourth explanation, and the one that makes the most sense. And that is, the witnesses, Susan was not lying. The witnesses were not lying. She did what she said she did. She told them what she said she told them. And they testified accurately about what was said. And the fact that there are differences, as we know, relates to who Susan was telling and what her comfort level was in demonstrating to her friends who she was. Oh, gosh, okay. that brings us to Dr. Loftus. I'm going to talk about her in more detail later, but this was a hired gun. And that's fine. You want to be a hired gun, you want to come in and get paid tens of thousands of dollars to testify for every serial killer, wealthy, Me Too, child molester, etc. That's your right, that's fine. You can do that. Do not pass yourself off as something you are not. And this is a woman who literally compared herself, she lied about it and got caught, compared what she does, the tens of thousands of dollars she gets, to Oscar Schindler. Who could even imagine that? I mean, in some ways, I don't know whose testimony was worse. But in the end, her testimony doesn't matter because she herself conceded that in the end, all she can do is she can answer reasons why someone can be honestly mistaken. And it has to do with implanted memories. And by the way, you can't have implanted memories of 8 different people who don't know each other, didn't talk about it. It's absurd. And the idea that I only asked her about certain things in this case, I covered her A to Z. I think everybody's aware of it. Some of you might not have liked it. Some of you might have said, hey, listen, why do you have to go after her? Why do you have to really try to take her apart? Because in the end, she's up here selling something that's not valid. That's not to say that there aren't situations where eyewitness identification is important or where memory isn't important. It just wasn't this case. Now, in the end, when Mr. Chesnoff wants to go with Dr. Loftus and doesn't want to acknowledge the evidence that his client is saying something to the contrary, you know where you're at. Okay, so what's the key thing about Dr. Loftus and who said it?
So it's your testimony, Mr. Durst, that you were aware prior to Susan being murdered that she had told people that she had called Albert Einstein pretending to be Kathy. Is that correct?
Correct.
And when did you find out about that?
I think Julie said something to me a long time before Susan Berman died. Like maybe 5 years before. And Shaven said something not that long before Susan Berman died.
Would it have
And
been?
there was also another lady, Ainsley Pryor, who said that Susan said she called the dean at Albert Einstein and pretended to be Kathy.
So I just want to be clear. So you're now saying that 2 witnesses who did not even testify, Ainsley Pryor and Julie Baumgold, you're now saying that they told you that Susan had told them that you had called, that she had called Albert Einstein at your request pretending to be Kathy. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you're saying that you knew about this information from all 3 of these people at the very least months and in some cases years before Susan was murdered? Is that correct?
Correct.
That's the issue. That right there, Dr. Loftus, is done. She has no relevance to this case. By her own admission, she has no relevance to this case at that point. Because Bob Durst is saying, hey, not only those witnesses, but 2 other witnesses who didn't even testify said the same thing. Now, why didn't the defense play this clip for you? Because it blows their theory out of the water. And they're clearly hoping that they can make an argument where they ignore Bob Durst's testimony that you're not going to see that their client is literally saying something 180 degrees different from their argument. That's what's going on in this case. Can you go to slide 60, please? Okay. This evolving defense is also demonstrated by Durst's literally outrageous and constantly changing statements. I mean, this is just a few of them. Barry Weiner, Barry Weiner, the Diginote, playing nursemaid to Diane Boucher. Industrial-sized tampons. What are those? Where's it even come from? Some woman is having some kind of vaginal surgery and she's coming home cooking dinner, putting an industrial tampon where she just had surgery and then walking the next day? You know, did the only thing, apparently, did Bob have her rub his feet that night as well? I mean, remember, the story's made up. It did not happen. It's a complete fabrication. But even in the fabrication, he is so sloppy with reality because apparently to him, he doesn't even understand that the idea of somebody coming home and having surgery and cooking him dinner, he doesn't even understand how outrageous that is. Because that's his life. The world is here to serve him. Yeah, of course she's going to make him dinner. I'm not going to make it. And is there a worse person? Would anybody have Bob Durst come play nursemaid? And would any woman say, you know what, I've just had vaginal surgery. Can I have my male friend come take care of me? It's absurd. It's made up. It's a lie. Oh my God. The 100-acre, that's my favorite. Danny Cunningham and the 100-acre farm with no electricity. I mean, hard to keep a straight face. And in fact, the statements, they're not just unreasonable, they're not just absurd. They're actually comical. Literally, you can't even look at them and go, well, that's a lie. You're laughing when you hear them. That can't be true. And by the way, it's easy to go, oh, Bob's entertaining. What a funny old man with this funny marijuana story. Yeah, that funny old man murdered 3 people, okay? So yeah, his statements can be humorous in some sick way, and he's very creative with it, but behind those statements is murder. 3 people. And again, like all of his lies, they sound good coming out, but as soon as you start examining them, they just fall apart.
I mean, I told lies all my life, and nobody ever said, Bob, you're a real good liar.
Probably the most true thing that he has ever said. Absolutely. He is not a good liar. He is a determined liar. He is a consistent liar. And again, not lying about things that are meaningless. And for any of you who are going, well, you know what, then we just have to disregard everything Bob Durst said in this case. Well, that's not true. And that's not what the instruction tells you. In the end, like most liars, if you listen to what they have to say, some truth will come out, even unintentionally. Where Bob Durst lies is where he's trying to protect himself, where he's trying to fabricate, etc. Those are the lies that you want to make sure you understand. So, again, I thought that the Danny Cunningham thing was really interesting for this reason.
A friend of mine from years ago, we were both at UCLA. He lived in Barbersville and earned a living selling marijuana. I went to his house next to the Redwood Forest in Barbersville and bought a pound of marijuana.
Now, remember, that was during direct examination. And by the way, he deliberately doesn't give a name because he hasn't really thought about it. So he comes up with this. He drove down to Garbersville to buy the pound of marijuana. Why does he have to do that? He has to explain why he's making the phone call from the payphone at 3 p.m. Most of Bob Durst's lies and what happens to him is he has to cover for something that he's in trouble for. So he has to explain, why did he fly out on December 19th to Northern California? Well, I got to come up with something. Okay, I'll come up with I'm taking care of Diane Boucher for her female surgery. But that leads to more problems. Well, what am I going to do? How do I take care of her? Then you have to explain, well, how come the next morning when you're taking care of her, you're going to the bank and driving down to Garberville to make a phone call? Oh, now I have to come up with the marijuana. The problem with Bob Durst's lies are he tells one, and then he has to tell 3 more to cover the one. And then not only is he lying about the one, but then you'll catch him in lies about the 3 that he came up with. So what happened with this? Well, during cross-examination on a completely unrelated topic that morning, if you remember, about the note, we were talking about whether the note said truck instead of trunk. which we got a stipulation, if you recall. Trunk. Not truck, trunk. So again, the whiner list doesn't make sense. It's not a whiner list. It's a dig note, as we said. That's why it has dig, and that's why it talks about all the ways to get rid of a body. But we give him that report by the handwriting expert in the morning.
Have you seen the January 19, 2018 report by Lloyd Cunningham? Have you had a chance to look at that report?
I looked at that report from the handwriting people. I don't remember their names.
Okay, I'm going to give you this report. I'm not going to have you look at it now, but I'm going to ask you whether you've had a chance to look at it later. But
So he looks at that report. He looks at it. We also put it up on the screen, if you remember. And he saw a name. And it was the name of that handwriting expert, which was Lloyd Cunningham. So at that moment, ladies and gentlemen, Danny Cunningham, the marijuana dealer, was created. Welcome to the mind and the lies of Bob Durst. And notice when he's asked in that afternoon about it, this is now we're going to ask him about the name, because he never gave a name to Mr. DeGuerin on direct. Listen to how he hesitates.
so you went down and you bought a pound of marijuana from your old friend from college days, correct? Is that correct?
Correct.
You know, I noticed, Mr. Durst, when you were testifying, you didn't give a name. Why didn't you give the guy's name? Why did you just call him an old friend from college?
I don't want to get him in trouble.
You're concerned that in 2021, he's going to get in trouble for a pound of weed that he sold 21 years ago. Is that your testimony?
My testimony is I did not lose his name because I did not want him to get in trouble.
Well, here, you don't have a choice. What's his name?
Danny Cunningham.
Danny Cunningham. I assume his name is Daniel Cunningham?
I knew him as Danny Cunningham.
Okay, this is literally the plot to the 1995 Kevin Spacey movie, The Usual Suspects. For those of you who don't remember, this was a movie where Spacey's character is being interrogated. The whole movie is an interrogation, and he creates this wild story of Kaiser Soze. That's Keysersoze. He is the alleged mastermind of this plot. And the whole movie is him describing it. And if you remember, at the end of the movie, Spacey's character is released because of the Kaiser Soze thing. And the investigator, there's a scene where the investigator looks around the interview room and he realizes, oh my God, all these details that were in the story, he's just taken from the room. He made the whole thing up. And for Bob Durst, he could have been up there, and I'm surprised that he didn't say, what's the guy's name? Danny Microphone, Danny Jury Box, Danny Bailiff. I mean, listen, it's funny because how does this happen in a trial? This is a bad movie. But that's what happened. That's who he is. That's how he lies. That's what he does. And you know what? You're going to be told in California 226, if you decide that a witness deliberately lied about something significant, you should consider not believing anything that witness says. Now, that doesn't mean the defense doesn't get up here and go, well, yeah, listen, we would love for you to forget about Bob Durst's testimony. Just completely disregard it. We don't want you to think about that at all. That's not what that means. What that means is that if you find that Mr. Durst is not credible, then the things that he has said where he's trying to exculpate himself, where he's trying to say, here's what actually happened, dig notes, Diane Boucher, staycations, etc., Barry Wiener, Weiner, you throw it out. You disregard it. By the way, how does this stuff come out? How do you figure out when somebody is lying? This is Professor John Henry Wigmore of Northwestern Law School. He was a very famous man. He was the dean there. He died in the mid-40s. I believe, I've seen in the judge's chamber, he has Wigmore's book. Judge Wigmore, here's the quote, "Cross-examination is beyond any doubt the greatest legal engine ever invented for the discovery of truth." What does that mean? Well, you know this at home. Anybody who has a kid, you get information out of them, because they have to tell it. You know, perfect example. You give a kid a curfew. Anyone who has a kid, your curfew is midnight, all right? Your son, it's 11:58, and I'm going to modify the story because anyone who has a kid knows this isn't going to happen. But at 11:58, you fall asleep, okay? And the kid gets home. The next morning, you see him. Are you going to say the following? Hey, son, listen. I waited for you till 11:58 p.m. last night. Your curfew's 12. What time did you get home? Of course not. What's he going to say? Oh, Dad, wow, I got home right at 11:59, right after you fell asleep. What you say to him is you say, hey, listen, you weren't home last night. You were late for your curfew. Even though at the time you're saying that, you don't necessarily, it's possible you could have gotten home at 11:59, because that's how you get truth. That's what it takes. And cross-examination in this case, that's what it took to get truth. And in addition, that's evidence, unlike argument. So the cross-examination in this case, we're not going to apologize for it. Another lie that was just incredible, which I could not believe, is, so Mr. Durst, this is the defense animation. And one of the problems with the defense animation, as we showed, is that Bob Durst cannot testify consistently with what's in the animation. He was on the witness stand shown this picture, if you recall. And he's asked, isn't it true the animation shows you grab the gun with your right hand from under the gun? What does he say? I grabbed the top of the gun over Morris Black's hand. I'm asking him, if you remember, to look at the screen. Mr. Durst, doesn't that show your hand underneath the gun? No, it does not. If you remember, what do? Basically, here's what he said to you as jurors. Are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? So it's not that he is good at lying. He's just determined. I mean, he'll lie about something directly in front of you. That's why that clip's up there. Your Honor, is it a good time for a break?
Yes, it is. Ladies and gentlemen, do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. Let's come back at 10.